Hi everybody, my name is Booray Perry. I'm from Tampa, Florida. I'm a professional photographer, and in this video we are going to talk about exposure. And what is exposure? Let me give you a little background real quick. I have a group on Facebook. It's called Pro Photo Talk with Booray Perry, and I was thinking about doing a couple of videos where I would just define some popular, photography terms, because there's a lot of weird terms we use in photography, and it can be kind of overwhelming if you're new to it. I mean, you can be doing this for years and you still won't quite know what the inverse square law is, for example. So don't feel bad if you don't know exactly what exposure means or anything else, because there's a lot of professional photographers who don't know what a lot of these terms mean as well. So anyway, I was thinking about doing a couple of videos and I posted in my group. I said, what kind of terms should I do? And man, the photographers came back with just dozens and dozens of terms. And I thought, wow, I never really thought about it, but there's so many different terms you have to learn if you want to really be good at photography. So I decided I would do a whole series, and this is the very first one in the series. Welcome to it. Congratulations, you've reached the beginning of the road. I want to try and put these terms into an order that makes sense. Start at the very basics and then work my way up to something more difficult, so that in a perfect world, you could watch these in order and actually learn a lot about photography step by step. And I'll tell you the other thing I'm doing with these videos, I'm not going to get too technical. At least I'm going to try not to get too technical. I really want to explain these terms in a way that just makes them easier for you to understand, because really you don't need to know the textbook definition. You just need to know the practical definition of how these things work. The first one I'm doing is this one right here, exposure. And this video is longer than it needs to be, I know, because this is the easiest one to define. When someone talks about exposure, when they're talking about photography, well, let's back it up a little bit and go to a time before we had digital cameras and talk about film. So we used to have film cameras, right? So there was a piece of film, and this film was very sensitive to light. So in order to get a picture, you would have to expose the film to light. Simple, right? Nowadays, we have digital cameras, and we have a sensor in the camera. And that sensor also very sensitive to light. It is full of receptors, and these receptors drink up photons, light. The photons pour into the camera, and they are captured by the receptors that are on the sensor. Then the chip, the processor in the camera, will take the information it has gotten from the photons and recreate what it saw, basically making a picture. But in order for this to happen, you have to expose the sensor to the light. And that's what an exposure is. It's really just a fancy way of saying, take a picture. And photographers love to use terms. I think every profession does this. We love to use accurate terms. Have you ever talked to a cop? Have you ever talked to a cop and you're like, so, the guy pulled out a gun and shot somebody. And then you talk to a cop and he'll say, well, the perpetrator pulled out a weapon and discharged it in the direction of an assailant, right? That's the way they talk. They always want to use technical terms, and we do the same thing. So if you are talking about an exposure, if someone says, oh, I'm trying to take a good exposure, I'm trying to take the right exposure, they're just talking about taking a picture. That's all. They're just talking about exposing the sensor or the piece of film to the light so that they can get a good picture. A good exposure is one where you have exposed the sensor to just the right amount of light so that you get a picture that looks real and authentic. Or, if you're not trying to look real and authentic, if you're trying to look really dark and moody, or if you're trying to look really, really bright, whatever you're going for, the correct exposure is the one that gives you the result that you want. And this is where it can be a little tricky, because people will say, what's the correct exposure? If someone says, what's the correct exposure? Generally what they mean is, what's the exposure that's going to give you a picture that looks realistic? That's what they mean. That's the correct exposure. But the truth is, the correct exposure is whatever you're trying to achieve with your camera. But generally speaking, when someone says, I want the correct exposure, what they want is they want the sensor to be exposed to the light, just the right amount of light, so the picture that they get looks real and authentic. And that's exposure. It's pretty easy. All right, there's going to be a bunch of these videos. This is the first one. So watch the next one. Watch the next one. We're going to get a little bit more difficult as we go along. And also be sure and check out my podcast. It's called Photobomb. It's available anywhere that podcasts are found. And I'd love it if you give it a listen. I've been doing it for about 5 years, and it's a lot of fun. I promise you will enjoy it. All right, stick around. Next video is coming up.